The weapon in your hand, or on a shelf, or in a museum, or in a movie you watched last week is the end product of one of the longest chains of incremental innovation in human history. The real story of how humans invented guns stretches back more than 1,000 years, passes through accidental discoveries in ancient China, moves through medieval Europe in ways that reshaped every war and every power structure it touched, and arrives at the modern firearm through a process that was rarely planned, rarely understood by the people involved, and full of surprises that no one predicted. Here's the first thing to understand. Guns did not come first. Gunpowder came first, and gunpowder was not invented by someone trying to create a weapon. It was invented by someone trying to create immortality. In Tang Dynasty China, probably sometime in the 9th century CE, Taoist alchemists, searching for an elixir of eternal life, were systematically experimenting with combinations of sulfur, charcoal, and other substances. The goal was chemical, mystical, and medical. The discovery, when it came, was violent. Chinese texts from around 850 CE describe alchemists who inadvertently created a powder that ignited explosively, burning their hands and faces and setting fire to their laboratory. The substance they had discovered was what we now call gunpowder, and the oldest known written formula for it appears in a Chinese military text from 850 CE, already being adapted for military use within a generation of its accidental discovery. This early gunpowder was used first not in guns, but in incendiary weapons, fire arrows wrapped in burning powder, bombs thrown by hand or catapult, flamethrower-like devices that projected streams of burning material. The explosive potential of gunpowder was understood and exploited militarily for roughly 3 centuries before anyone seems to have had the crucial insight that changed everything, that an explosion contained within a tube would project whatever was in the tube outward with tremendous force. The earliest devices recognizable as firearms appear in Chinese records from the 12th and 13th centuries. The fire lance was a bamboo or metal tube packed with gunpowder and attached to a spear, initially designed to project burning material and flame at enemies at short range. Over time, practitioners discovered that adding pellets, fragments, or small balls to the tube before igniting the powder resulted in those projectiles being launched with significant force. The fire lance evolved gradually into the hand cannon, a metal tube closed at one end with a small touch hole, packed with powder and a stone or metal ball, ignited by a burning match or ember. This device, dating to at least the 13th century in China, is the recognizable ancestor of every firearm that came after it. This is where it gets interesting. Because the transformation from fire lance to hand cannon to the weapons that would reshape European history was not driven primarily by inventors trying to improve weapons. It was driven by war's brutal process of field testing, in which whatever worked was adopted and whatever killed its users was abandoned, with very little theoretical understanding of why any of it worked. Gunpowder knowledge reached the Islamic world and then Europe through a combination of trade, military contact, and intellectual exchange during the 13th century. Roger Bacon, the English friar and philosopher, wrote a description of gunpowder in the 1260s that suggests he was aware of its properties, though whether he understood the formula independently or encountered it through Islamic intermediaries is debated. By the early 14th century, European metalworkers were producing cannons, large metal tubes capable of projecting stone balls heavy enough to demolish medieval castle walls, the defensive architecture that had defined European warfare for centuries. The cannon did something to the social structure of Europe that its inventors almost certainly did not intend. Medieval fortifications, castles, and city walls were the physical foundations of feudal power. A lord with a stone castle was militarily secure against almost any force that couldn't spend months besieging him. Cannons changed this equation dramatically. Walls that had stood for centuries could be breached in days. The military technology that had enabled the decentralized power of feudalism was suddenly obsolete, and the political structures built on top of it began to shift in response. Historians have argued that the cannon was one of the crucial technologies behind the consolidation of power into centralized nation-states in Europe, because only a king with enough resources to field artillery could now credibly threaten any rival. The handheld firearm, the weapon a single soldier could carry, developed in parallel with the cannon but more slowly, because the engineering challenges of making a reliable handheld weapon were considerably greater. The earliest European hand cannons of the 14th century were heavy, inaccurate, slow to reload, and as dangerous to the user as to the target. The matchlock mechanism, developed in the 15th century, was the first major step toward a practical handheld firearm. Instead of requiring the shooter to hold a burning match to the touch hole with one hand while trying to aim with the other, the matchlock used a mechanical arm, the serpentine, to hold the burning match and bring it into contact with the powder pan when the trigger was pulled. This freed both hands to steady and aim the weapon, dramatically improving accuracy and usability. The wheellock followed in the early 16th century, replacing the open burning match with a spinning steel wheel that created sparks when it contacted a piece of iron pyrite, similar in principle principle to a modern lighter. This was a significant advance because it eliminated the need to keep a burning match lit at all times, making the weapon usable in wet conditions and allowing it to be carried loaded and ready to fire, a crucial tactical advantage. The flintlock, which appeared in the early 17th century and became the dominant firearm mechanism for roughly 2 centuries, replaced the wheellock with a simpler, more reliable mechanism, using a flint struck against a steel plate to create the spark that ignited the powder. The flintlock musket armed European armies and the armies of their colonies across the world from the early 17th century through the early 19th century, and it was the weapon that determined the outcome of conflicts on every inhabited continent during this period. Chemist and industrialist Elias Howe and gunmaker Samuel Colt, along with dozens of other inventors in the 19th century, drove the next critical transitions. The percussion cap in the early 19th century replaced the flintlock's exposed spark mechanism with a small explosive cap that fired reliably in wet weather, and the development of the metallic cartridge, in which the propellant charge, the projectile, and the priming mechanism were contained in a single sealed unit, made repeating weapons possible. Before the metallic cartridge, reloading required the shooter to pour powder, seat a ball, and prepare the priming mechanism after each shot, a process taking 30 seconds to a minute even for a trained soldier. A cartridge-fed weapon could fire multiple rounds in seconds. The repeating rifle, most famously exemplified by the Winchester designs of the 1860s and 1870s, and the revolver, associated most closely with Samuel Colt's designs of the 1830s and 1840s, used the metallic cartridge to allow multiple shots before reloading. These weapons did not merely change military tactics, they changed the political and economic landscape of the American West, the outcomes of colonial wars across Africa and Asia, and the psychology of personal safety and threat that has shaped societies ever since. Here's the modern mirror. The firearm in its current form, whether a handgun, rifle, or automatic weapon, is the result of a chain of innovations stretching back more than 1,000 years to Taoist alchemists in China, looking for the key to eternal life. Every mechanism, every refinement, every tactical adaptation was made by people who often had no idea their contribution would matter a century later, or what it would lead to, or how the world would be different because of what they had done in a workshop, on a battlefield, or in a laboratory that sometimes caught fire. The weapon is the end product of 1,000 years of human ingenuity applied to a single problem. The ingenuity is not the problem. The ingenuity never is.